Hi, I'm Matt Barnett, co-founder and chief strategist at SEVNX, and today we're breaking down how to get started securing your cloud infrastructure. The cloud, where it's your data and someone else's problem. Just kidding. Today we've got 7 steps to help you get started securing your cloud infrastructure. And of course there's 7 steps because there's 7 of everything at SEVNX. In fact, this video will probably be 7 minutes long. But as more and more organizations transition their workloads to the cloud, new infrastructure is coming online at an increasing rate and often without proper security vetting or change management processes or other common due diligence that most on-premise deployments go through. And I think one of the main reasons for the gap is that new on-prem is difficult and new cloud is easy. There's no upfront expenses, there's no procurement process, no capacity planning, no traditional constraints of any kind. And when you break it down to the ridiculous, everything seems too good to be true. It's kind of like that old sales tactic at car dealerships where they try to sell you the upgraded $120 a month model, and they break it down by saying that it's only an extra $4 a day, right? That's a cup of Starbucks. And when you think about the cloud and a server being $4 an hour, that seems really cheap until you look at 720 hours and realize that that's almost $3,000. So I think that, it makes it really easy to do pilots in the cloud and R&D in the cloud, and all of that is great. But much like the security aspects, if you're not careful, some things can get away from you. And so I thought this video was timely and appropriate as we've seen a dramatic uptick in customers asking for cloud security assessments. So let's get started. Step 1, get organized. Like I said before, cloud sprawl is real and it's easy for it to get away from you. So start by inventorying all of your cloud service providers and then what workloads are being run in each of those cloud providers. Don't forget to survey the entire organization, so your marketing departments and PMO departments that may have acquired cloud services that aren't being managed by IT or secured by IS. This is especially true of third-party providers or SaaS providers, as they can sometimes be brought online without any IT costs or infrastructure requirements. So you may see some of those that exist that you're just not aware of in the IT world. A helpful hint here, make sure you use descriptive labels for all of the assets at your cloud service provider. Don't just rely on the auto-generated IDs from Google and Azure and AWS. Actually put real labels to them so that you know what your virtual machines and your static IPs and databases are all for. And that's going to help you really with my next point, which you're probably not going to want to hear, but you should do anyway, which is build a RACI matrix for all of these assets out there so that you know who's accountable and where to put the proper responsibilities for managing these pieces. Okay, so on to step 2, create a formal adoption process. We want to make sure that as we bring new services online in the cloud, that we're doing so in an approved and authorized way. And that means putting R&D pilots and new instances and etc. all through our change management process to get approval and security hardening and all of these other things that should come along with the new infrastructure put in place as we stand these things up, even if it's for a short period of time. And it's especially true if it's a short period of time because we want to make sure that we don't just leave things up and let the cost run away, as things are much easier to forget about in the cloud. Speaking of maintaining security, that brings us to step 3, baseline your cloud settings. The cloud's a big place and it's easy to get lost. So fortunately, there are organizations that have helped pave the way for us by providing benchmarks and security hardening guidelines for us with regard to our cloud infrastructure. Specifically, the Center for Internet Security has foundational benchmarks and they apply to most of the major platforms, so Azure, AWS, Google, IBM, etc. And the MITRE framework is also great at helping us kind of threat model and figure out which attacks we're likely to face as an organization based on, you know, the industry that we're in or the types of deployments and services that we're using. Okay, so on to step 4, baseline your infrastructure settings. You know, you'll often hear cloud security providers talk about the shared security model, where they're responsible for the physical security and they're responsible for a portion of infrastructure, mostly tenant isolation and keeping you and your neighbor separate. And then you're responsible for the infrastructure all the way through the application. So much like your on-prem infrastructure, we should have functional equivalents for gold images in the cloud. VMs and should have standard configuration guides, checklists, other security standards that take the guesswork out of protecting our infrastructure. Okay, step 5, use the cloud the way it was intended. To use the cloud the way it was intended, we need to rethink common IT management and infrastructure paradigms. Said differently, don't bring your on-prem baggage to the cloud. This requires some relearning and can be time intensive, but I promise it'll pay dividends. You know, as a basic example, look at a traditional marketing website. To deploy it on-prem, you generally require a full stack server, so 2 if you want redundancy, and if you do 2, then you need a load balancer and etc. But that problem isn't necessarily easier to solve in the cloud. It's just that it can be cheaper and more resilient with less IT management. But it does require you to understand how various infrastructure as a service components interoperate to truly realize the benefit of cloud computing. Bringing this point back to security, the cloud can handle complicated processes like identity authorization and access control, key management and rotation, blob level encryption, a ton of other best practices without expensive overhead and steep learning curves. But the services really need to be explored, implemented, and tested. Step 6, logging and monitoring. Logging and monitoring has become a commonplace term in recent years, and all the cool kids are doing it. But we need to be careful. Logging isn't as simple as just turning it on. It's not one of those Ronco Showtime rotisserie machines where you can just set it and forget it.
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 Why? Because the default logging may not capture what we really care about from a security perspective, and the signal to noise ratio is frankly absurd. There are 2 aspects to cloud monitoring that we really need to be concerned with. And the first one that we need to account for is within the tenant itself. So that means privileged actions within the console or the CLI for each of these cloud service providers. So what kinds of actions are being taken on the tenant itself in terms of creating user accounts and building out infrastructure and enabling or disabling things at a subscription level. And then the second thing we need to look at is the cloud services that you're using within that CSP. So serverless functions and databases as a service and etc. We really need to look at what logs are available to us and what we're going to capture and what capturing that means. I mean, how are we going to be alerted to anomalies? What is an anomaly? What are you going to do to track and triage things that, you know, happen in this world? So the worst part is, after you configure all of your logging in that environment, there's no juicy chicken at the end. It's just a bunch of dry data.
You just set it and forget it.
You just set it and you forget about it.
You just set it and then forget it.
Still working on that. Okay, step 7, be proactive. The one thing about the cloud is that decomposing all of these traditional paradigms into single services or microservices really gives us the ability to enable some pretty neat monitoring that may reduce the needs or demands for a traditional security MSP. Tools like Azure Sentinel and risky sign-on detection and continuous access evaluation for Azure AD can help identify and proactively mitigate risks associated with compromised accounts or potentially compromised accounts. Guardrail in AWS Control Tower can take automated preventative actions in response to detective alerts that we set up. So, you know, these are the types of things where The cloud service providers are really going above and beyond to help us get control of the cloud and specifically our responsibilities for security in there. So take advantage of those and spend some time doing some R&D and piloting programs to see if some of those security services don't help you offset or reduce security workloads in other places. So that's it this week. If you found this video helpful, make sure you give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more great content. If you'd like to dig a little deeper, we're here to help. I'll leave our contact info in the description below, and have a great week. We'll catch you on the next one.